to specific organs. Taste, smell, vision, and hearing, they are in special places. But here's a question. Where is the only place on your body you can feel cold? What's the only place on your body you can feel pain? What's the only place on your body where you can feel touch? Is your skin the only place that you can feel pain? Skin the only place you can feel pain? No. Just on the surface? Anybody ever had a baby? I haven't, but that's an extreme example. Sure, bones and muscles hurt. Yeah, intestines hurt. When you have an intestinal infection and you feel, stomach cramps or intestinal cramps, it hurts really bad. You can feel pain. You can feel pain all over. You ever had a headache? Yeah. Not just skin, right? You guys get my point. I've given you a big example of what our focus in this chapter is going to be is on those special senses. The general senses we kind of talked about 2 weeks ago when we talked a little bit about those receptors. We talked about many of them starting on page 177 and following, those pages there, especially like 179 where we talked about the touch receptors, different kinds of receptors, but even like proprioceptors, body position receptors, they're located in lots of places. The special senses aren't special because, oh, you're so special, like their mom told them they were so special, right? Not that kind of special. Special because they're not found all over and within the body. They're found in highly specific locations. We're going to look at two in great detail. We're going to look at vision. Whoops. We'll start with the anatomy of the eye and then talk a little bit about the physiology of vision. And then in the second half, we'll talk about hearing, starting with the anatomy of the ears. And then for a limited amount of time, right at the end, we'll finish up by talking about taste and smell. They actually have a lot in common, so we can kind of talk about them. They're unique and different, but they do have a lot in common. So just in the last few minutes of class, we'll kind of finish up with taste and smell. But our big focus today, this afternoon, is a lot of time talking about vision and the structure of the eye, and a lot of time talking about the structure of the ears and hearing. So when we start with the anatomy of the eye, it's always a good idea to begin with the external structures of the eye, because these are the things that we see when we look at ourselves in the mirror every day, a lot of these external structures. And some of them are both kind of external and a little bit below our eyelids, like this one. This is called the lacrimal apparatus. And the word apparatus refers to the fact that there actually is a lot of structures working together. And we'll talk about certain specific ones that you need to know. But what does the word lacrima mean? What does lacrima mean? Come on, you guys. I really practiced my little drops. I really practiced my drawings of my drops. Yeah, tears. Yeah, lacrima refers to the word tears. It comes from a Latin word that means crying. Oops, I don't know what happened there. Crying. So lacrima means tear production. I know that you guys know this, but we don't just produce tears when we're sad. We produce them when we're happy. But we don't just produce them when we're happy or sad. We produce them constantly. A small amount of tear production is always happening to keep the surface of the eye and the underside of your eyelids, but also protected from infection, as well as a lot of other factors. Well, let's look at the structures known as the apparatus specific ones that I think important to know. First, where do all the tears come from? They come from called the lacrimal gland. Notice where the lacrimal gland is located. This, if you look in this image, we're seeing a lot of skeletal structures here. But over here on this side of the image, you're looking at, this is the nose. This nasal cavity's there. And this is the medial side of the eye. This little thing right here, lacrimal caruncle. And that's where your tears come from. It's a common understanding. Your tears go to there. They come from these glands that are located behind this bone right here. This is your, somebody tell me what bone that is. Somebody tell me, what bone is that across the top of your forehead? What's that bone? That's good. That's the frontal bone. So, frontal bone, there. What's this right over here? There's a suture, a connection right there. What's this bone right here? We sometimes call it your cheekbone. It's this bone right here. This one's the maxilla. This one's the maxilla. Zygomatic. Yeah, this is the zygomatic bone. Yeah. So just behind where your frontal bone meets your zygomatic bone, you can kind of feel it probably just right across your brow where your skull kind of turns inward to form your eye socket. And there's a bit of a bump right there. And just behind that bone, nicely protected by that bone, is your lacrimal gland. Well, I've labeled the ducts that come out of it, but specifically the lacrimal gland. Let me label that, really kind of the main one you need to know. So where is the lacrimal gland located? Well, superior lateral surface of the eyeball, kind of the top lateral side of the eyeball, behind the frontal bone. All right, big key idea, because most people, if you ask a lot of people what that is, they'd say, oh, those are my tear ducts, or they would say something about it. But look at you now. You're so well educated. You know that little thing in the corner, it's more like a tear sponge, so to speak. It actually has little ducts that channel the tears and that collect them and channel them, and they drain into this, what's referred to as the nasolacrimal duct, and they empty right into the lower part of the nasal cavity. So that's where your tears go, and that they're constantly draining there. Like I said a minute ago, you're never really not making tears unless you have a patient who has a disorder of dry eyes, where otherwise healthy eyes are just constantly making tears, and they sort of sweep from lateral to medial and get collected by this little caruncle. So that's kind of the next statement there. Discuss the flow of tears from lateral to medial. What is the function of the nasolacrimal duct? To collect those tears and carry them into the nasal cavity and release them into the lower part of the nasal cavity. So here's a really important question. What's in tears? What is the composition of tears? Let me ask you this way, because I want you to give me some answers. And I want you to give me more than one, because there's a lot. If I said, what is the number one component of tears, what would you say? That was an easy one. Come on, I'm starting with the easy ones this week, guys. I'm trying to get you warmed up after spring break. Yeah, water. Yeah. Get you nice and warmed up after the spring break. You've had a mental break. Water. The second most abundant thing is probably sodium chloride, electrolytes. We sometimes might say salt, and that's okay, but I do want you guys to understand specifically that, remember from the beginning of A&P 1, and you'll be reviewing this for the final exam soon too, that this is an ionic compound. So when it gets dissolved in water, these separate into sodium ions and chloride ions, what we call electrolytes. Okay, and those are only technically salt when they're dehydrated and had the water removed, and they crystallize into the stuff that we sometimes call table salt. So just by way of clarification, I want to make sure, kind of looking at it from the future clinical perspective, we want you to understand that tears definitely have a number of electrolytes in them, but the most abundant electrolytes are probably sodium and chloride. Yeah, rather than saying water and salt, sodium and chloride are probably the second most abundant things. Great. Now let's, I won't try to number them because, to be honest, off the top of my head, I don't know what the next most abundant things are, but there's a lot of things that we could put that are also in tears. So tell me, something else that just, maybe you've already got it written down, you've watched the video. Lysozyme, I like it. Lysozyme. Yeah, it is an antibiotic. Lysozyme is a chemical that is toxic to a lot of bacteria. Obviously not all bacteria. People still get bacterial infections. So not all of them, but some. Something else. What else? Have you got anything else? Yeah, there's some mucus. Yeah. Now mucus, that sounds gross. Because we think of, well, if you're like me, when you first come across the word mucus, you kind of think of it as a 5-year-old kid runny nose. All right, that mucus has a lot of dirt and pollution and pollen trapped in it. But mucus in and of itself is actually just water with a protein called mucin, and it does help keep the eye hydrated. It's very liquid. It's very much like the consistency of saliva. Your saliva has mucus in it also. So it's very, very fluid, like the consistency of saliva. So when we say just plain mucus, don't think of a kid's nasty mucusy nose. Think of it more in a little bit more accurate way. But yeah, mucus. There's also some lipid. There's some lipid, like an oil-like substance. We'll see this here on the next slide when we talk about the eyelids. But this helps for what? Why would there be oil? Just a little bit of oil in your tears. What does it help do? It's kind of the same reason why your skin produces a little bit of oil as well, if you can recall back there. Lubrication, yeah. But I was thinking of another reason why your skin also produces it. I'll definitely give you credit for lubrication, but there's another reason why there's oil in your tear. And there's not much, it's just a tiny amount. Slow evaporation, yeah. Waterproofing, yeah. To reduce evaporation, to keep the eyes moisturized. Yeah. Good way to think about it. Which cranial nerve innervates the lacrimal gland? We talked about these so long ago. Yeah, cranial nerve, no, it's the facial nerve. Do you remember what its number is? Can you do the Roman numeral for the facial nerve? Cranial nerve number. Looking for that caps lock key. VII. Yeah, cranial nerve number 7, facial. Excellent. Nice. It innervates that lacrimal gland while it's coming out here to innervate your muscles of facial expression, like you've got, all around this area here, you've got your orbicularis oculi that help you squint your eyes. Right there. Right over here, you've got your zygomaticus muscles, and some of the branches just go right there to your lacrimal glands and innervate those. We will talk about the autonomic or somatic nervous system. We'll talk about the autonomic next week, but the simple answer to that question is autonomic. That question, the lacrimal gland is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. And basically, somatic is mostly voluntary. It's kind of a way of saying, yeah, it's not voluntary. It's difficult to control your tears unless you're like a really good actor or actress. They seem to be able to cry on cue, huh? I've never figured out how they were able to do that. Layers of the eyelid. This is the part that I said we kind of mentioned about that oil. From superficial to deep, the eyelids have the following layers. Now, of course, right on the surface is the epidermis. Then what comes next? Let's kind of see if right here is your epidermis. And then what's right under the dermis? Whoops. Okay, dang. That's what I get for trying to think and talk at the same time. So epidermis and then dermis, kind of number 2. And then a muscle. There's a muscle right here. What is that muscle? It would kind of be number 3. Oh, I've got it listed here too. Let me show you how far out of the game I am. I'm the one that needs the warm up from spring break. So this is the muscle. I've already got it listed here. This is an interesting word. Levator palpebrae superioris. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Superioris means the upper. Palpebrae is the Latin word for eyelid. I don't know why they couldn't have just used the word eyelid. It's so much easier than palpebrae. Levator means lifter. So this is an interesting word when you translate it from Latin. It means a lifter, muscle that lifts the upper eyelid. That's kind of how that goes. So I'll hear these muscle fibers of the levator palpebrae superioris muscle. Then you get to tarsal plate and glands. The tarsal plate is sort of pictured here. It's not labeled, but it's a sort of a connective tissue. It's not exactly cartilage, but it's very similar to cartilage. And it helps to kind of lift and contract these muscles. There's another just mentioned I want to would be the orbicularis. Sorry, that's a mess right there. Orbicularis oculi. Orbicularis oculi. That was the one that I intended to be number 3 right there. And then levator palpebrae is number 4. So the orbicularis oculi, yeah, I know, I got you. I got you, Anisha. I knew where you were coming from. I was just a step ahead of you. It's rare. I need to enjoy being a step ahead of you guys because usually I'm 2 steps behind. So orbicularis or oculi is this one right up here that I mentioned. And then the levator palpebrae, that's back there, and it's the one that pulls on the tarsal plate. So I'm going to label it on my diagram right here, tarsal plate there. And what's important about the tarsal plate is there are glands on the underside, and these glands are the ones that secrete the oil right onto the surface of the eye. So now remember, your tears come from the lacrimal glands. The oil, just a tiny amount of it, comes from the tarsal glands, as they're known. And they are just on the underside. My picture's not big enough. And they're not really in the picture, but they would be on the underside of this tarsal plate. So every time you blink, they give a little coating of oil to the tear fluid that's already there and help keep the surface of the eye moist. And then finally, I'm going to get to those other things here in a second. The deepest layer under the eyelid is a thin layer that is simple cuboidal. It's even simple squamous in some places, called the conjunctiva. And it's on the underside of the eyelid, but it kind of curls back around and doubles back on itself and covers the surface of your eye, except for the cornea, which is the clear part that light passes through, right? So this part there that's kind of bluish, that's called the sclera. That's the white part of your eye, and it's covered with conjunctiva as well. All right. So these glands can get infected, and so you can kind of get what's known as a chalazion or a sty in your eye, where it's sort of an infected tarsal gland, and it gets clogged, and it can swell up and be very painful. But you guys probably know that the conjunctiva can get infected too. What is this one? Hopefully this one's kind of easy. You've probably heard of it before. The most common viral infection of the conjunctiva, and it's very contagious and very common in nursery school age kids. Yeah, it's called acute conjunctivitis, or pink eye, as it's sometimes called. I have had it. My kid brought it home to me one time. I never had it as a kid. It's kind of crazy. I never had it as a kid. I had it as an adult from my kid. It's like, oh, the wonderful things that you get for having kids. I wanted to show you this. These may, I don't mean to gross anybody out with like these giant pictures of close-up of an eye. This is a chalazion, and typically a sty is going to be more at the edge. A chalazion is an infected, clogged tarsal plate. A sty is more clogged eyelash follicle. Both can be very painful and kind of present the same way, but notice how clear the white of the eye is, called the sclera. Notice how clear that is, all right? That's covered with a super thin, clear layer called conjunctiva. You can't really see it. And that conjunctiva folds back over here. So this shiny layer on the inside of the eyelid is also covered with conjunctiva too. So, but this right, oh yeah, sure, it can be in the top eyelid as well. But the conjunctiva is fine. The conjunctiva is not infected. On the right, you can see how that otherwise clear layer that covers the sclera, that's filled with usually invisible blood vessels. Those blood vessels are dilated so badly because the viral infection that the sclera looks bright red. So I wanted you guys to be able to see the difference between a sty that is under the surface or in the eyelid, but the sclera is still clear, as opposed to actual true conjunctivitis, where the conjunctiva is bright pink. Looks itchy. If you guys have ever had it, you know what I'm talking about. It isn't itchy. It is painfully scratchy. Like every time you blink your eye, it feels like that feeling that there's just this big piece of something under your eyelid scraping your eye. But your eyes are clear, but it feels like that. Like your whole eye is constantly scraped by some dirt that's trapped under your eyelid. And I know everybody's had that happen, so you know how that feels. But it's kind of like your whole eye feels like that. And it looks itchy, but it's really far more painful than itchy. Now, it's really itchy when it's healing. It goes from being painful to really itchy when it's healing. And you wake up in the morning and you can't open your eyelid. I want to use a word other than goopy because I don't want to gross you out. But it's so goopy, it's like it's plastered closed. And I had the time that I had it, one morning I woke up and I literally had to physically separate my eyelids to get them to open. They were so goopy. Anyway, let's move on. That's disgusting. Come on, everybody. What are we talking about this for? Let's talk about the muscles that move the eyes. This is kind of at the top of the next page. The muscles that move the eyes are called the extrinsic eye muscles. Extrinsic means outside. Okay? That, just calling them that implies that there are also inside eye muscles. We'll talk about those in a little bit here as well when we get to the bottom of 188 and we look at the internal eye anatomy, and we will find that there are muscles in there as well. So big difference. I want you to make sure that you focus on this. It's kind of in the middle of page 188. It says, what is the difference between extrinsic eye muscles and intrinsic? So before I get into these, here's the big difference. Skeletal muscle. The extrinsic eye muscles are skeletal muscle. The intrinsic, which are the muscles inside the eye, are smooth muscle. Now, I'm going to ask you, get ready to type an answer. What's the big difference between skeletal muscle and smooth muscle? There's some differences in like striations and not striations, but I'm talking about what's the big difference in control. Voluntary versus involuntary. Exactly. You can voluntarily, excellent. You can voluntarily move your eyes to look around the room or to look at somebody. You cannot voluntarily constrict your pupils when you go from inside to outside on a bright day. The smooth muscle in your iris will involuntarily do that. So that's a big concept. So all of these muscles on this page that you see here, all of these muscles are voluntary skeletal muscles. We'll talk about the intrinsic smooth muscles. I think I got them on the next slide or slide after this. Okay, so the way that I've organized them on my slide is I've tried to organize them according to the questions that are listed below that one question that I just had you answer, right in the middle of 188. So rather than just listing the 6 extrinsic eye muscles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is fine, you can list them in any order. I like to learn them, and I like to have my students learn them according to the cranial nerves that innervate them. So the first question there says, which muscle is innervated by the trochlear nerve? So the trochlear nerve is this one. It's cranial nerve number 4. I'm going to put its nickname here, trochlear. The trochlear nerve. And only one of these muscles, called the superior oblique, I usually abbreviate them with 2 letters, superior oblique, is innervated by that trochlear nerve. I'm going to show you where it is in my diagram over here. It's this one right up here, and it kind of folds through this little loop right there and then comes down and attaches to the top of the eyeball. If you look at the eyeball from the top, you can see this is the superior oblique muscle. Your nasal cavities are kind of right over here. So right along that wall next to your nasal cavities, the superior oblique, and its tendon actually goes through this little hook. And in Latin, the word for a tiny hook is the word trochlea. You don't need to know that, but that's kind of where the nerve gets its name. It gets its name, the nerve gets its name because it goes to the only muscle of your eye that goes through this little hook. And you can see how that superior oblique comes in towards the top of the eyeball and will pull on the eyeball and pull it up. So that's the one muscle innervated by the trochlear nerve. The one muscle innervated by the abducens nerve is cranial nerve number 6, is this one called lateral rectus. Lateral rectus. Now, again, over here, here's your nose, and so your ear would be right out here in this area. So this is the lateral side of your eyeball, and this straight muscle that comes in straight from the side. That's what his name means. Lateral rectus, coming straight from the side. That's your lateral rectus. Here it is over here in the far right diagram. Again, your ear would be way, way over here on the right side of the picture. Here comes lateral rectus right there. And when it pulls on the eye, it actually makes, let me kind of sketch it. When lateral rectus pulls your eyeball, it's going to make your eyeball point towards your ear. It's going to cause your eyeball to point in the direction of your ear. Okay? And if you guys remember the different kinds of muscle movements that we've talked about before, if your arm is in anatomical position, your arms in anatomical position like this. What is the movement called when you lift your arm out to the side like that? Abduction. All right. That's where this cranial nerve gets its name, because it abducts the eye. It makes your eye move to the side, move out to the side. So that's where abducens nerve gets its nerve name. It's kind of its nerve nickname, so to speak. Then the third question there in the middle of 188 asks, I always kind of giggle sometimes, because I don't mean it disrespectfully, but I think it's kind of funny sometimes how our lecture notes ask a question and then kind of has the answer right there in the next sentence. I don't know if you guys are, I'm sure you're experienced enough to have picked up on this. Which nerve innervates the other four muscles? Next line says, note, the oculomotor nerve also innervates. You kind of just gave away the answer right there in the next sentence. Some of you guys are sitting out there going, Nichols, why did you not tell us this at the beginning of the semester? Why did you wait for us to figure this out all this time? And some of you are like, yeah, I totally knew this the whole time. Oculomotor. Yeah. Have you noticed it a good bit? It's like a pretty typical pattern in the way that it's put together. These other four cranial nerves are innervated by oculomotor. And the oculomotor also has branches that go to those intrinsic eye muscles that constrict and dilate the pupil and strip the lens and so on. So oculomotor, cranial nerve number 3, a very busy nerve. You can see why its name is oculo, which means eye, motor, which means movement, eye movement. Its name literally means eye movement, both outside and inside. So these other muscles, all four of them are innervated by those nerves. Okay, so those are those external muscles. Let's look at the internal anatomy, and as a part of this, we will get to some of those intrinsic muscles when we get a little bit deeper down. But I'll just kind of show you where we're headed here over the next few slides. We're just going to kind of look at the eye in progressive layers, so to speak. Think about the eyeball as kind of like a basketball. It's sort of hollow, but it's actually a basketball, and the walls consist of like 3 layers. That's just a tragic diagram. I don't even want to look at it anymore. But you get the basic idea. I'm going to try to sketch it along with this diagram where an artist did a much better job than myself. So the eye, the wall of the eye, consists of these 3 layers, and you can see them labeled real nicely over here. The outermost layer that's called the fibrous layer, they're sometimes referred to by the word the Greek word tunic, which is just another word for a layer. A tunic is a fibrous layer, and then the middle layer is called the vascular layer or the vascular tunic. It's kind of this tan, and then the little bit slightly more pinkish internal layer right there is called the nervous tunic or the nervous layer, not because it's nervous, but because it consists of nervous tissue. And so those are the 3 main layers. Now, this diagram from your textbook, these are kind of the major layers, but you can also see that each of these layers has some subdivisions as well, and we're going to talk about those over the next couple of slides, okay? And then we'll finish by the structural part by looking at this specific part here, the neural layer, which is technically referred to as the retina, or the retina, as I used to say to myself, to make sure that I knew how to spell words. I would say anatomy words in a funny way inside my head to try to trick my brain into spelling things correctly. So that first layer, so the fibrous tunic, is the outermost layer, and it actually has several subdivisions. The sclera, which, now this picture is a little busier, but it's showing us kind of the same perspective. The sclera is what we sometimes call the white of the eye. What kind of tissue is the sclera made of that makes it so white? What's it made of? Very much like your dermis. Yeah, dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue. What protein is dense, irregular connective tissue made of that makes it so white, that makes the sclera so white? But what is the abundant protein in dense, irregular connective tissue? So we talked about this obviously earlier in the semester, and we kind of talked about it again when we talked about dermis. The dermis of the skin. Abundant fiber type in dense, collagen. And another place we talked about this, collagen, especially talking about collagen being bright white. Another place we talked about it was with tissue repair. When wounds heal, and if they heal by fibrosis, it's mostly collagen, and that's what causes a scar. And in fact, the word scar comes from the same word as sclera, which is for bright white. Kind of a word for that bright white in, I can't remember, Latin or Greek. I don't remember which language. But one of those ancient languages is where the word sclera comes from. So the word sclera is similar to the word scar because they have a similar word origin, bright white collagen. Now, it says name two functions of the fibrous sclera. One of the main functions is to keep light from getting through any other. It's bright white to reflect light. All right. The other one is attachment for these in our diagram. Here some of our muscles, like the medial rectus muscle. Here's our lateral rectus muscle right there. And you can see their tendons just merge right into the sclera. So attachment points for those extrinsic muscles that move the eye. Now, right about here, we don't get any collagen fibers anymore. It's still a part of the same layer. It's still a part of the same layer. But it doesn't have all that collagen in it anymore, so it's clear. And this is the part known as the cornea. Cornea contains no blood vessels, but there's fluid behind it. There's a fluid behind it called aqueous humor. Aqueous humor, which means watery fluid. That's what the word aqueous humor means. Watery fluid. But also tears on the front. So every time you blink, not only are you clearing the surface of the cornea of any dust or pathogens, but you're also washing the surface with fluid that contains amino acids and glucose, nutrients for the cells at the surface, because, believe it or not, this cornea actually consists of layers and layers of living cells that you, like, as you're looking at your computer screen right now, as I'm looking at my computer screen right now, I'm actually looking directly through several layers of live cells that I can't see because my focal distance is too far away, but I'm looking right through those cells right at the screen. And we know this is true because anyone who's ever scratched their cornea knows that it can also be very painful. It can blur your vision, but it can also heal as well. The cornea is living cells that can heal, right? So those are the two structures of the fibrous tunic. The next layer in, deep to that, is called the vascular tunic. And like its name implies, there's a lot of blood vessels in the vascular tunic, and they give it a bit darker appearance. But there's also some other stuff in the vascular tunic that gives it an even darker appearance. So the parts of the vascular tunic, most of it is called the choroid. Choroid. And that sounds like the choroid plexuses that we talk in the ventricles of the brain. And that comes kind of from the same name, these networks of blood vessels. But the choroid is really, we see it better over here on this part of the diagram. It's all of this here, this section, immediately under the sclera. If we were to cut just the sclera away, we'd see the choroid, and it all the way around here. It's where all the blood vessels are that nourish the inside of the eye. Whoops. All along in here, that in-between layer. All right? But it is darkly pigmented as well. So it's got blood vessels. We've got a couple of functions. Blood vessels nourish cells. Okay, there's one function. But what about that dark pigment? What kind of pigment is it that's in the choroid? What's the pigment that's in the choroid? Melanin, yeah. We've talked about melanin before. What does melanin do? What does melanin do? What's its job? It absorbs what part of light? What part specifically? No, it reflects color. It reflects UV. There it is. Yeah, melanin absorbs UV. Now, it has other things that it does. It kind of makes tissues a little bit darker or brownish or kind of reddish brown. And you see that when you look at the choroid of the eye, but that's not its function. That just happens to be the wavelength of visible light that it reflects. But what it collects is it absorbs UV radiation. Okay? Why? What can UV radiation do? What can UV radiation do? It can cause cancer. It can damage DNA, and it can damage and cause cancer. You know what your eyes do? Your eyes take light from the sun. I'm going to damage your retinas. I'm just kidding. I love the sun. It's a beautiful thing. You can't live without it. But the UV radiation that comes into your eyes, there's this thing we haven't talked about yet. We're going to take a second. I'm going to point to it. This lens, and it focuses the light to give you a sharp image on the back of your eye so that you can see an image sharply on the back of your eye. But let me tell you this, it focuses light so well that it also focuses the parts of light that you cannot see, like UV radiation, that could potentially damage the cells of the retina back here at the eye, or the whole eye itself. And in fact, people at retinal cancer is a thing. It's a thing that can happen. So I encourage you guys, always wear your sunglasses on a sunny day, especially if you have blue eyes. If you have really lightly pigmented eyes, there it is. Nice. Yeah. I have brown eyes. I have really kind of dark eyes. So I don't get kind of the hazy, blurry vision on a sunny day that a lot of people with very light blue eyes sometimes get. But I still always wear my sunglasses, and it has nothing to do with looking cool. It has to do with the fact that every time I teach this, I say to myself, it's worth a little extra money to buy good sunglasses with UVA, UVB polarized lenses that add that extra, especially living in the South. We have short winters. We are outside a whole lot more. The sun can be super intense during the summertime. There's no reason not to just do a simple thing, make a simple investment, and go out there and get a good pair of sunglasses, because that sun has that UV radiation. Now, your choroid, getting back on track, your choroid is going to absorb as much of that UV radiation as possible. It also helps to absorb some of the visible light so you don't really get like a double vision. I don't know if you can see it really well down here in the bottom, but as the light comes through, it's actually going to pass through the retina before it hits the choroid. And if the choroid was reflective, the light would bounce back out. It would reflect like a mirror back out. But instead, the light gets absorbed by the choroid, so you don't get like this double image, or the brain doesn't get confused by this double image. So the melanin absorbing UV radiation is critical, but it does absorb some of the visible light too. So now around the front, let's move on. Around the front, right out here, we get this kind of enlarged area that wraps all the way around circularly. It's just right behind where the sclera becomes the cornea, where the sclera becomes the cornea. Right behind that, the choroid becomes this thing called the ciliary body. The ciliary body. And the ciliary body has a couple of major functions to know. The ciliary body has these things called ciliary processes. This would be what you could put for little letter A in the kind of top middle of page 189. Ciliary processes, and I've got, what you need to know over here. You can jot this down if you don't have it. But those processes secrete the fluid that flows behind your cornea and kind of flows around the inside of the eyeball too, called the aqueous humor. They secrete that fluid, these little ciliary bumps, ciliary processes. But there's second thing, little letter B, ciliary muscles. And that's what's illustrated. Maybe you can see them better over here. These little bands right here are bands of smooth muscle, and they will pull on the edges of the lens to change the shape of the lens, which helps change your focus. And you do that every time you go from a near object to a far object. So where you're sitting right now, try this little experiment. So you're looking at your computer screen. If you're not, everybody wake up, look at your computer screen. Okay, so look at your computer screen and then look up from your computer screen across the room. If it's 5 feet away or 10 feet away to the wall beyond your computer, whatever, your lens needed to adjust to focus. And I think it's really cool to kind of go back and forth. Look at the wall, look back at your computer. Look at the wall, look back at your computer. Do it 2 or 3 times, not so much you make yourself dizzy. But going back and forth, you can see how rapidly your eyes can adjust focus far and near. And that's exactly what these muscles, called ciliary muscles, in the ciliary body do. They've got these little ligaments all the way around spokes on a bicycle wheel. They kind of just go all the way around the lens, like the spokes of a bicycle wheel, and the lens is like the middle of your bicycle wheel. And they pull from all sides, stretching the lens. The last major part of the choroid is also pigmented, and it's called the iris. It's the pigmented part of your eye. It's pigmented with melanin too. Its major job is to filter and screen UV radiation, but to kind of block a lot of the light so that most of the light comes through the hole in the iris. And what's the name of the hole that's in the middle of the iris? What's the term for the hole in the middle of the iris? What's that called? It's that little hole. Yeah, that's called a pupil. That's the pupil. So we sometimes say the iris adjusts the size of the pupil. It adjusts the size of the opening to allow more light in if it's dark or less light in if it's really bright. And so the iris is muscular. It's got smooth muscle. Now remember, that's an intrinsic eye muscle, as are these ciliary muscles. These are also intrinsic, and that means they are both controlled by cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor. Oculomotor. Okay, so they too are controlled by that oculomotor nerve. Okay, and this is what happens. I know everybody's kind of familiar with what happens. We talked about this just a little bit when we finished with the cranial nerves a few weeks ago about pupil dilation and pupil constriction, and these intrinsic eye muscles that control the eye. The two muscles, now this is little a and little b under the word iris. What two intrinsic eye muscles are located in the iris, and they are referred to as, we can kind of list these however you want, but I'll just put little letter A and letter B, dilator pupillae and constrictor pupillae. The dilator pupillae muscle, or the pupillary dilator muscle, it opens the iris in darker or decreased light intensity. The constrictor tightens or closes the pupil a little bit in brighter light or increased light intensity. Okay, so the three intrinsic eye muscles, I think I just kind of summarized them, but here we go. Here are two of them right here at the top of the page. Dilator pupillae, constrictor pupillae, and the other was the ciliary. Muscles. Yep. So where it asks you to list A, B, C, the intrinsic eye muscles, those are those three. Are these smooth or skeletal? They're smooth. Which are innervated by the oculomotor nerve? All three. Okay. Any questions there? Kind of move on in here. This is our deepest layer called the retina, or the nervous tunic. The retina consists of multiple layers. We'll look at all of the layers in a minute, but first we're going to focus on the layers that really do what we call the seeing. They're the ones that are called photoreceptors. And remember, that's a type of sensory receptor that's sensitive to light. And there's really, I don't want this to be confusing. There really are four types. There's one type called rods, and then there are three types of cones. One type called rods and three types called cones. Which of these do you have the most of? Which photoreceptors do you have the most of as a human? It varies from species to species. Which of these do you have more of? Yeah, humans have a lot more rods than most other animals, to be honest. Like I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry. We do have a lot. Let's put it this way. I kind of misphrased my question. We have more cones than most other species. We have more cones than most other animals. The cones are for color vision, and the rods are more for low light slash shapes and even movement, like that. And so the rods are definitely the things that your dog or cat has the most of, or your rabbit, or your pet deer, or your pet llama or giraffe, or like really most other animals, cows, horses. They don't have a lot of use for color vision, but no, they do have them. They do have them. I didn't say they didn't have them. They have more rods than we do. They have way more rods than we do. It's just a difference in proportion. So for us, our species has evolved to be more daytime hunter-gatherers, thinking of our ancient ancestors, daytime hunter-gatherers and nighttime sleepers. Now, this doesn't count you guys that work third shift. I know you're out there, but you're working in opposition to the way humans evolved to be as hunter-gatherers and huddling together, sleeping at night when so many other animals are out there hunting for food. So animals that, not just predators, but definitely a lot of predatory animals. just don't have a whole lot of need for cones because they can hunt it. It's not just nighttime. It's the shape and movement thing that really helps them too. It's difficult for us to even understand how they see what they see, but they can track and process move better than we can. We have rods. We just have more cones than other mammals do, if that makes sense. I don't want to spend any more time talking about this. It's more confusing than it matters. It's not even a bold-faced concept in the book, so you don't need to worry too much about it. But we want you to know what each type of sees. And I think I've got, yeah, here we go. I'll get back to that slide. Here is a segment of the retina. Let me go back to this slide for just a second, and we're going to look at a zoomed in view of, I'll get to them. I'm getting to them. We're going to look at a zoomed in view right down here. You tell me what the names for the cones. No, I'm just kidding. You know them. You've watched the video. So you guys can see right down here, down at the bottom. So we're going to look at this tiny little section right here, flipped upside down. So what we're actually looking at is we're just kind of looking at this thin little layer of retina. And the retina actually consists of layers of cells. When we look at it under the microscope, all of these little nerve type cells, and look at these little ones right here with the little point. Those are the cones. All right? And look at these little bar ones. These are the rods. So even humans, as despite the fact that we have more cones than other animals, we still have more rods than cones. All right? So that was confusing when I seemed like I was flip-flopping, but you guys typed it correctly in the chat. So I want to kind of be straight with everybody. You know, Juanisha and Ernestina, who said, you got more rods than cones. That's correct. What I meant to say, what I got confused myself about, was we have way more cones than most other good. I'm glad. I hate it when I kind of have to walk it back where I kind of like, I talk myself into a corner because I'm trying to talk and think at the same time. The cones are for colors. So it does not mean that dogs, cats, bears, llamas can't see colors. They just don't see maybe the range of different combinations of colors and depth of color that we see. So we have basically three types of cones. And what are our three types of cones? What are the three different basic colors that our cones can see? Yeah, RGB. RGB. We have some cones that see best in the red part of the tube. They're not just red, but they do the best when you shine a red light on them. They'll send higher frequency impulses. We also have green ones, and they do best under green. You know, any kind of light will make them send low frequency impulses, but when you shine a green light on them, they get so excited. And blue. And basically every color you can see, which amounts to, neurologists have estimated around 10 million distinct colors that the human eye can see. 10 million distinct colors. I can't even name every one of the crayons that's in the Crayola box of 64. Like, I can get be red and brown and blue, and then in that box there's also different kinds of blue, and I don't even know what they're called, right? I can't even do 64 colors. But the human eye can potentially see about 10 million. Contrast that with a dog that's about 1/10 of that, maybe 1 million different colors. But a dog has been selectively bred from a predator. What were dogs selectively bred from? What predators were dogs selectively bred from? Wolves, which boggles my mind every time I look at a poodle I'm not going to rag on anybody's dog. I'm not making fun. Or a Chihuahua. I kind of go, how are you related to a wolf? Not seeing it. But they are. And those predatory animals just don't really need to see color. They need to see movement. They need to see shape and size of a potential prey animal. And they depend, when hunting, they depend more even on their hearing and smell than we do when we're out there hunting and gathering. So, which nowadays is just pushing a cart around the aisle at Kroger. I kind of laugh every time I'm doing that. I'm like, oh, my hunter-gatherer ancestors would be super disappointed at how I've turned out. So the rods, you can see the rods, and there are not three distinct types of rods. They all kind of work basically the same. And you can see how they're embedded in this layer of the retina. And right behind these cells is called the pigmented epithelium, the pigmented part. And this is not the choroid. There's also, back here, there's also the big thick choroid layer, but the pigmented part of the retina is also melanin, also pigmented with melanin, and that helps absorb unnecessary excess light. The rods and cones are the photoreceptors. These rods and cones, when they detect light, they'll generate action potentials that they will fire through their little axons to the next layer of cells called the bipolar cells. The bipolar cells will generate action potentials to the third layer of cells. There's really 3 layers of cells that make up the retina. And they'll fire action potentials through these 3 layers to the ganglion cells. And the ganglion cells, these are their axons right here. All of these things are their dendrites. This is their cell body or their soma. And these are their axons. And their axons all merge together. You know, kind of like bundling a bunch of threads together. Or, you know, like if you have long hair, kind of like pulling all of your hairs together into a ponytail, a single bundle. And they all bundle together and travel together. Now let's go over here to this picture over here. Here are those ganglion cells of your retina, and all of their axons bundle together and literally become cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Cranial nerve number 2. So cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, is literally just the bundled axons of the ganglion cells of the retina. Okay, and again, the signal comes from way out here. The light comes from here, and it passes through those 3 layers until it hits the tips of the rods or cones and generates an action potential that they fire back in the other direction to the bipolar cells. The bipolar cells then send an action potential to the ganglion cells. The ganglion cells then will send an action potential all the way back to, well, let me ask you. You ready? Ready for some thinking? Here we go. If you're ready for some thinking. Except for the sense of smell, all of your senses have to go through what major sensory gateway in the brain? All your senses except for the sense of smell. So this was a few weeks ago when we talked about the brain, and we talked about it as kind of like the major sensory gateway. Every sense has to synapse in its good thalamus, the thalamus. So that's where all of these axons are going to go. All of these axons will terminate with synapses in the thalamus, and then the thalamus will route those around to what lobe of the brain? What lobe of the brain is in charge of vision? What lobe of the brain will the thalamus send the impulses to? The occipital lobe. Yeah, occipital. Right. So that's where this is all going to go. That's where all of this stuff is going to head. Now, I skipped a little bit of stuff on the slide I want to go back to. Oh, I talked about it. How are they distributed in the retina? What type of light does each see? So they're pretty pretty widely distributed, except most of the cones that you have are very close to the very back of the eye. So if you look at the back of this picture that you see on the right side is what you would see using an ophthalmoscope. It's what the eye doctor sees. They look directly into the back of your eye, and they use a light that shines to the back of your eye, and it reflects of this. This looks like a light shining from behind your eye. I always think it's kind of creepy, but what it actually is that's reflection off of your optic nerve. That circular space is called the optic disc, but it's really your optic nerve. And the light that's on the ophthalmoscope is reflecting back, kind of back at you on the screen as you're looking at it. And we know that is the blind spot, and you can see over here on the left, the reason for that is because basically your retina is upside down. It's sort of backwards. If the photoreceptors were flipped around the front, be the first to get the light, and then they would send the image backwards to the bipolar cells and then back to the ganglion cell. All of the ganglion cells could leave the eye through the optic nerve, but you could have a whole layer of photoreceptors all the way across this space. But because the retina is backwards, you end up having to have a place right here where there can be no photoreceptors because you've got all the ganglion cells bundled together. The result is you end up with a blind spot. Each eye has a blind spot that's just in slightly to the lateral side of your vision. And that's because that's where the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye. Okay? Now, right over here is an area called the fovea centralis. Fovea centralis, the central fovea. It's kind of a word that means sort of your center of focus. This is where your best focus is. So this is actually where most of your cones are located as well. Your sharpest color vision is right in the middle of that fovea. So this is a blind spot. You have no photoreceptors at all. And then just a few millimeters over here is the place where sharpest vision is. Let me go back, show you guys where this is on this diagram here. So here comes the light. It's coming straight through, and the lens and cornea will focus it, and your sharpest focus is right there on that fovea. That's where most of your cones are located. And then just right over here is your optic disc, where you've got the blind spot, and your lens flips the image in such a way that you would notice the blind spot over in the lateral field of view. When the light kind of comes in this way like this, any of that light from your lateral field of view, what we call your FOV, your lateral field of view over towards your ears, is actually going to be flipped passing through the lens, and it's going to hit, it's kind of hard to see, let's make it a little better. It's going to actually hit more on the part of the retina on the medial side, but there will be a little spot where the light will hit, but it doesn't hit any photoreceptors. That spot, that's the optic disc. So there's an area right out in here. Now this would be like if you're looking at a specific spot, like a little period on a page, on a sentence, you look at that specific spot, that's going to be the dead center of your field of view. Your blind spot will be a little bit out to the lateral side, and you won't see it unless you close your other eye. Because the other eye can see that area over there, and it makes up for the blind spot. You can't see your blind spots in either eye without closing the opposite eye. And you can kind of try that trick at home where you can sort of try to see where your blind spot is. And everybody's got one in each eye, basically. A couple of other things about some of the structures, the visual structures, the lens and the interior spaces behind and behind the lens of the eye. Now, the lens is a structure that kind of separates this area called the anterior cavity of the eye. Let's see if I can kind of draw a line right through the middle of the lens, like that. All right, so everything in front of that is called rear cavity. Everything behind it is cavity. And so the lens is the boundary. This anterior cavity is actually split. You can see it right here. It's actually split into an anterior chamber and a posterior chamber. And the boundary for that is the iris. So let me kind of draw in a different color, maybe make it stand out a little bit. I don't know. So the iris, nope, that doesn't stand out at all. Doesn't show up at all. So the iris is the boundary between the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity. Confusing. So the whole anterior cavity, both posterior and anterior chamber, are filled with that liquid fluid called aqueous humor. Remember that it is secreted from those ciliary processes. You can see it coming out here, kind of being secreted and circulating around. Some of a little bit to the back, but it's going to run into this big jelly ball in the back of your eye called the vitreous humor. The vitreous humor. Now the vitreous humor takes up most of this posterior cavity behind your lens. And it is what? What does the vitreous humor do? What is its function? What does the vitreous humor do? What does vitreous humor do? That's not adequate. Come on, you guys. We've been at this for almost a full semester. The word protect is not a full answer. You got to say, if you're going to say protect, you got to say, what's it protecting from? What is it protecting against? You know, something like that. It holds the shape of the eye. Yeah, it maintains the shape of the eye, keeps it from collapsing. Yeah. Tristica, what says chamber? I've got chamber in a couple of places, and I've got cavity in a couple of places. I think I've got them in the right places. But what is it that says chamber? I don't want you to be too confused. You just drew a blue line? I don't see your blue line. Oh, yeah. Yep, a vitreous chamber. Yep. That's because that's something we're not going to ask you to memorize. So the posterior cavity has a aqueous chamber and a vitreous. It is not in your lecture notes, so don't worry about it. Okay? Let's focus with... this stuff is too confusing. So don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So these ciliary processes secrete the fluid, the aqueous humor, that kind of circulates around. Yeah, I didn't call it vitreous chamber. I called the structure that is in it the vitreous humor. The structure that is in it is the vitreous humor. And the vitreous humor is found in a space known as the vitreous chamber, but it doesn't occupy the entire posterior cavity. There is an anterior chamber of the posterior cavity filled with aqueous humor, and then there's a posterior chamber of the posterior cavity known as the vitreous chamber. Now, if you didn't understand that, that is fine, because you don't you don't need to know it. All right, you don't need to be able to distinguish it. But I didn't want you to go away confused. But I didn't want anybody else to go away thinking they had to know what I just said. All right, now you do need to know what I'm about to say. The ciliary processes produce this fluid that flows around the lens and bathes the lens, but look at it flowing forward. It flows forward through the pupil out into the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity. Again, the fluid itself is called the aqueous humor, and it's collected by these canals of Schlemm, the canal of Schlemm, which collects that aqueous humor and basically recycles it back into the blood where it originated from. So Schlemm are located right at the junction between the sclera and the cornea, right there. Okay. So what happens if you make more aqueous humor than you can drain out? So we have to have a balance between fluid production and fluid drainage. It has to be balanced. But if more aqueous, this is a question right at the top of page 191. If more aqueous humor is produced than can be absorbed by the canal of Schlemm, what results? I can almost guarantee it's going to be a test question. Did that get everybody's attention? Yeah, glaucoma. Glaucoma, or glaucoma, as we sometimes call it, glaucoma. Glaucoma. Increased fluid pressure inside the eyes. It is the number one cause of adult onset blindness. Number one cause of adult blindness. What is one of the main causes of what? Again, I don't statistics. There's a couple of them that I want you to know. Diabetes is one of them, but it's not the number one cause. Diabetes mellitus is one of them. What's the number one cause of glaucoma? This comes with age. It's a common side effect of aging, but can be managed and should be managed regularly. It's one of your vital signs. One of the vitals. What about blood pressure? When it's high, what's the word for that? When blood pressure is high, hypertension. Number one cause of glaucoma, number one cause of adult onset blindness. Diabetes mellitus gets a lot of play, a lot of attention. As well it should. It definitely should. But the one enough is the epidemic. I don't throw the word around lightly nowadays. But the epidemic of high blood pressure, of hypertension in the American adult population in particular. Yeah. So major cause of glaucoma. Major cause of adult blindness. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of show you this again with those cavities and the vitreous humor. So this posterior cavity that I mentioned before is really mostly filled with this. I'm going to try to sketch it because it's not right in the picture. It's not actually in the picture. I'll see if I can sketch it. This big jelly ball that fills most of the posterior cavity, the vitreous, and I'm intentionally kind of spacing it a little bit because it does maintain the size of the eyeball. That's its major thing to do. But it also kind of helps adjust the focus a little. But there is a tiny bit of aqueous humor in the posterior cavity as well. So this would kind of be called the anterior chamber of the posterior cavity, and where the vitreous humor is the vitreous chamber of the posterior cavity, or the posterior chamber of the posterior cavity. Ridiculous. Ridiculous. But it seems ridiculous to me. But if you're an ophthalmologist or an eye doctor, definitely very, very important to know. Make sure that you're also familiar. It says beginning with the cornea, name the structures that has to pass through in order to reach the retina. So let's sketch that out. Of 191. Here comes light, like this, and looking at it very close, the first thing it hits, obviously, light follows a straighter line than I can draw. The first thing it hits, obviously, is the cornea. But after it passes through the cornea, what's the next thing that it hits? Right there. The aqueous humor in the, you ready? The aqueous humor in the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity. But yes, aqueous humor for short, aqueous humor. That's found in that anterior chamber of the anterior cavity. And the light will pass on through that aqueous humor. Then it's actually going to pass through this opening called the pupil. All right. If it doesn't pass now not all light hits the pupil. Some of it's going to just slam into this iris and get absorbed by the melanin in the iris. Some of it can make it through the iris, but most of it can't. It might just hit the end of the line for light. So we're really only talking about light that's going to be able to go all the way to the retina at the back. So cornea, aqueous humor, pupil. Then it's going to pass through this tiny little area before it gets to the lens. This is the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity. So there's it's still all aqueous humor as it passes through the pupil. Then the lens, and then when it comes through the lens, it's now in the posterior cavity. There's a little fluid, but then it's going to hit the vitreous humor. Again, not really pictured here. Draw a big old vitreous humor here again. This giant jelly ball for illustration purposes. All right, so lens, a little bit more humor, and then a little more aqueous humor, and then vitreous humor, and it's going to go all the way to the back of the eye. Here, let's go back to this picture. So it's coming through the vitreous humor until it hits the retina. Okay, so really, the way the question is phrased, the last thing before it hits the retina is vitreous humor. Does that make sense? All right, before we take a short break, let's take a look at some practice questions. Let's take a look at this first one. Which of the following is characteristic of the optic disc? Which of these is characteristic of the optic disc? Yeah. Contains no photoreceptors. Contains no photoreceptors. In the pathway of light, we're going to get you in a second, Juanisha. I got your question. We'll get to it. In the pathway of light reaching the photoreceptors, once the light ray has passed through the vitreous humor, that's that jelly ball, it will next pass through which structure? Okay, in the pathway of light reaching the photoreceptors, now this is more detailed than what we just talked about. So now we're talking about, to get to photoreceptors, it's going to have to pass through what layer of the retina first on its way to the photoreceptors? I'm going to go back to a picture and then we'll come back to this question. There's a nice illustration in your textbook that shows this. Okay, check it out. Pathway of light, right about where my little finger pointer is the vitreous humor, the jelly ball, right? And which will it pass through first on its way to the photoreceptors? Okay. Let's make a guess. It's going to go through the ganglion cells first, then passes through the bipolar cells, which is not one of the choices, passes through the bipolar cells before it finally hits those photoreceptors, and then the action potential is going to be generated by the photoreceptors. The action potential that's going to send to your brain will go from photoreceptors to the bipolar cells back to the ganglion cells. Oops. That the light already passed, and then the ganglion cells will send it to the thalamus, and then they'll synapse there, and the thalamus sends it to the occipital lobe. Okay? Now, all right, so Juanisha asked a question. I missed what is unique about the synthesis of the vitreous humor. That's because I didn't say it. But unique about the synthesis of the vitreous humor. When is the vitreous humor formed? Well, you might be just getting sleepy too as well, but I didn't mention it. But I'm happy to go back and ask the class, when is that vitreous humor formed? What's unique about its synthesis is when in your life it is made. When is it formed? Before. You have it before you're born. It forms during fetal development. And another thing that's unique about it is it doesn't grow much once it is formed. What does that mean? If it doesn't grow much once it is formed, what does that mean? That means that when you are born, those eyeballs are about the size that they're going to be as an adult. And that's why babies have such big, beautiful eyes. We love looking at the eyes of babies. They're so big and beautiful. Have you guys seen those like big-eyed plushy dolls? They sell them at basically every convenience store. My kids are all about them. If you've never noticed them before, you obviously don't have children. But these big-eyed little, like Beanie Baby type dolls, and people love them because adult humans are evolutionarily attracted to big-eyed creatures because that creates an attachment bond between parent and newborn baby. And kids love them because they just love looking into eyes. We'll look at that. All right, so we're going to, we'll talk about this physiology of vision. We'll take a short break. We'll talk about physiology of vision. Like I told you guys, most